Hello, I'm Mike Swenson, one of the team leads in the Missouri River Basin Water Management Office. This is video number 4. It is recommended that you view the videos in order. This presentation, I will be discussing the expected results of our regulation for the authorized purposes in 2020. Before we discuss the impacts to individual authorized purposes, I want to discuss our current monthly regulation forecast. Slide 20 shows system storage in million acre feet. The black line is the actual system storage going back to last year. The blue line is the basic regulation forecast based on the April 1 runoff forecast as discussed in video number 3. We also bracket the basic runoff forecast with a wetter and drier runoff condition and then use that as input to the reservoir simulation model, and we refer to those as the upper and lower basic simulations. Those simulations are shown here as the red dashed lines. These simulations give us a range of reservoir elevations and releases that may be expected under various runoff scenarios. You'll also see the 3 green triangles which indicate 3 system storage checks. The March 15th storage check sets the service level for the first part of the navigation season. The July 1st storage check sets the service level for the second half of the navigation season and also the navigation season length. The September 1st storage check sets the winter release from Gavin's Point. If you follow the black line, you can see that we started last year at the base of the annual flood control zone. We had the second highest runoff on record last year, and with that went into the exclusive flood control zone. And then that water was evacuated by late January of this year. We stayed near the base of the flood control zone until we started to get the plain snowmelt, with storage rising in early March. Under the basic forecast, system storage continues to rise as we capture spring runoff and the melting mountain snow. System storage peaks in the summer around 63 million acre feet, and again that water is evacuated prior to the start of next year's runoff season, while providing for the authorized purposes. The next 3 slides are a similar sort of chart for the upper 3 large reservoirs, showing elevation rather than storage. All 3 reservoirs currently have some water in their annual flood control zones. Slide 21 shows Fort Peck. Last year, Fort Peck peaked up in the exclusive flood control zone. You'll notice that the rise from the melting plain snowpack this year does not have the steep slope that it did last year. Fort Peck is currently 2.8 feet below last year at this time. Following the blue line, again that's the basic forecast, shows a peak elevation just under 2241 after the capture of the melting mountain snowpack. Slide 22 shows Garrison. Garrison also peaked up in the exclusive flood control zone last year. Again, the rise from the melting plain snow this year is much less than last year. Garrison is currently 4.4 feet below last year at this time. The basic forecast has the reservoir peaking near 1846. And finally, slide 23 is Oahe. As with Fort Peck and Garrison, Oahe peaked in the exclusive flood control zone last year, and again you see the dramatic climb in elevation in the spring of 2019. Oahe is currently 6.5 feet below last year at this time. The basic forecast has the reservoir peaking near 1615. So now I'll move on and talk about the individual project purposes. First, on slide 24 is flood control. As we saw on slide 20, all of the 2019 flood water was evacuated from the system by late January. With the higher runoff forecast that was discussed in video 3, releases will likely be higher than average this year. As noted on earlier calls and news releases, we have been aggressive with releases this winter and spring to maintain flexibility in the reservoir system with the conditions of the downstream levee system as a consideration. Actual runoff will drive decisions as we move through the coming months. As you saw in the previous slides, storage is available in Fort Peck and Garrison to capture the mountain snowmelt runoff. However, it's important to note that flooding can still occur due to upstream and downstream rainfall. our ability to reduce downstream stages diminishes as you move further downstream due to increased travel times. This is particularly true downstream of Gavins Point due to the long travel times and also due to the large unregulated area below the system that you saw on the graphic in Kevin's presentation. Slide 25 shows Mainstem hydropower generation since 1954. Hydropower generation is largely influenced by runoff. As you can see, generation has been higher during recent high runoff years, but it's lower during the drought periods, for example, starting in 2000. The current forecast for annual generation is 11.2 billion kilowatt hours, which is above the long-term average due to the higher runoff forecast. Last year's energy was 13.0 billion kilowatt hours, which could supply the yearly needs of over 1 million residential customers. The next authorized purpose I'll talk about is navigation, which is on slide 26. If you attended a meeting the last few springs, we discussed increasing the service level to help in the evacuation of water from the system. In times of high runoff, the service level is determined using system storage, forecast runoff for the remainder of the year, and storage in select Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs. The service level is currently 10,000 CFS above full service. Based on the March 15th storage check, the service level will be at least full service during the period of April through June, and it is likely that the service level will remain at the expanded service level. Under normal conditions, the next storage check is on July 1st. However, with the higher runoff, we will make additional adjustments as necessary for floodwater evacuation. The current basic forecast shows an expanded service level and a 10-day extension to flow support is likely after July 1st. Moving to slide 27, water supply, water quality, irrigation, and recreation are all on the same slide, and these project purposes require access to water. The regulation forecast shows with above average runoff that there will be generally above average releases and reservoir elevations. No impacts are expected to irrigation and recreation for this basic forecast. For water supply, the basic forecast shows Gavins Point winter releases of 20,000 CFS for basic and upper basic, and then 12,000 CFS under lower basic based on the September 1st storage check. On slide 28, we have the regulation for fish and wildlife. Our goal is to provide steady to rising reservoir levels at the upper three projects, that's Fort Peck, Garrison, and Oahe, during the forage fish spawn. Rising reservoirs at these projects is a reflection of capturing spring and summer runoff while reducing peak flows from the reservoirs. If runoff is insufficient to keep all three reservoirs rising, the plan would favor Garrison. What I mean by favor is that releases will be adjusted at Fort Peck and Garrison to keep Garrison rising during this period. At this point, it appears steady to rising levels are likely at all three projects except under the lower basic condition, but reservoir levels are dependent on timing and distribution of runoff. We will try to minimize hours of zero release at Fort Randall this spring and summer, although this becomes difficult during some flood control operations where we have to quickly change releases to respond to conditions downstream of the system. Moving on to slide 29, I'll talk about the regulation for the lease turns in the piping plovers. With the high runoff forecast this year, it will be runoff that drives our operational decisions. This is similar to our regulation over the last 2 years. If conditions begin drying out, it's possible we will implement releases for the birds in May. Gavins Point releases during the tern and plover nesting season can include a steady release flow to target regulation. In a more average year, this operation involves setting a steady release at the beginning of the nesting season that will allow us to meet downstream targets through a portion of the nesting season, and then, if necessary, as downstream conditions dry up, we flow to target or increase releases as required to meet flow targets downstream. Cycling Gavins Point releases involves a pattern of releases, 1 day up at the steady release level followed by 1 or 2 days down at some lower level. Cycling in some years is done for flood risk reduction. This year we may or may not cycle releases depending on downstream conditions and targets. In a typical year, we implement intraday or hourly peaking patterns at Garrison and Fort Randall. These patterns provide consistent stages at sandbars downstream of the project during the tern and plover nesting season. This year, the fluctuation at Fort Randall will likely be less due to the higher daily average releases that are expected this summer. And to the extent we can, we will continue to implement measures to minimize take. So in summary, on slide 30, the current forecast is for above average runoff, and with that we expect higher reservoir levels and releases. Lastly, I just wanted to mention on slide 31 you can see our weekly update. Some of the data that we presented in our videos is summarized and updated each week and is posted to our website. The link is shown at the top of this slide. This concludes my video presentation. Thank you.